22. Justine was walking through West London streets under a cold blue sky. The houses around here were big old brick structures. Some of them had corner turrets with conical roofs, and the black shingles made them look like witch hats. Justine had never noticed that before, and it worried her. She felt like she might be losing her grip. She found herself beginning to sweat under the leather jacket, a familiar symptom. The condition was called stoned paranoia. It was particularly likely to hit you when you were on your way to score, as Justine was now. But Justine knew a sure cure for stoned paranoia. She kept walking, feet clattering on the pavement, aware of her own breathing, watching the streets telescope endlessly on this unreal day. As soon as she saw a policeman, she crossed the road and went straight up to him and asked for directions, asking him the way to Portobello Market, just like a tourist. She didn't even bother listening to what the policeman said. She just stared attentively up into his face, her sense of control returning. The policeman was white. He wore the traditional London cop headgear and a heavy coat against the cold. He was young and tall and handsome, but his face was so pale, and he had such dark rings under his eyes that he looked like he was a fever victim. There was something wrong with his skin as well, a mottling and a dampness. Justine stared at his face in fascination. You don't expect policemen to have skin conditions. He smiled at her, and his teeth were marvellously even and white. And sharp. Whatever happened to the traditional greasy roll of banknotes? Said Mrs. Woodcott, scooping the 1 quid and 5 quid coins off the table. It's just not the same doing a deal anymore. You young junkies these days. You just don't know what you're missing. She counted the money as she put it into her purse. I'm not a junkie, said Justine. I'm a soldier for a cause. Of course you are, dear, said Mrs. Woodcott. And as she said the words, they seemed to echo in Justine's head. A rush of déjà vu began to hit her. She had heard exactly those words before, in exactly this place. In a pub called the Moonchild on the corner of Powis Square. In a small back room of the saloon bar with nicotine-coloured walls and ceiling and heavy old wooden tables. A glass of Polish vodka was in front of Justine, ice melting and thinning the alcohol. The old woman called Mrs. Woodcott was sipping a port and lemon. Any moment now Mrs. Woodcott would say, What are you looking at, dear? The policeman. There were 3 policemen over by the crowded bar. One of them met her glance as she looked across at them. None of the men wore uniforms, but Justine could spot a policeman in plain clothes, even in the Saturday crush at the bar. The undercover men all had something subtly wrong with their faces, an unhealthy colour, pale and splotchy. It made Justine think of mushrooms you found in the autumn on the damp underside of a log. You rolled the log over, looking for treasure, and all you found was the wood rotting away to dark coffee granules to feed the clinging fungus. Or maybe it was just the lighting in the Moonchild. A line of multicoloured Christmas lights was strung up over the bar. Above the Christmas lights was a crossed pair of sabres from some antique war. They were old, but they looked remarkably clean and sharp. Justine had to tear her eyes away from them, from the light gleaming on their blades. Now 2 of the policemen were staring at them, not bothering to conceal their interest. Mrs. Woodcott stared back at them unperturbed. London's finest. Has this place become a CID boozer or something? Not as far as I know, said Mrs. Woodcott. She made no move to hide the pill she had placed on the table. It was a fat, shiny black and yellow capsule. Justine quickly put it away in the place she prepared. That's a nice locket, said Mrs. Woodcott. Justine wasn't listening. She was looking at the policemen again. They were all smiling. Their teeth appeared to be unnaturally sharp. I know what you use those pills for, you know, said Mrs. Woodcott. You young people, all you goths and punks and crows. You use them for nice things like morgue parties. Justine nodded, unable to reply. She was sweating heavily again. The door of the pub had opened, bringing in a flood of cold air that found its way to the saloon bar. Justine shivered as it hit her. Following the cold air through the pub door was the uniformed policeman, the one she'd asked about directions. His face looked worse than before. Mrs. Woodcott had a large fabric Harrods bag. She put her purse back inside it, and as she did so, Justine got a look at the other contents. Old jam jars full of the black and yellow capsules. Mrs. Woodcott saw her looking and took out one of the jars, setting it on the table in plain sight. The policemen were all staring, including the PC who had just walked in. Justine tried not to let it bother her. She was still shivering, although the pub was warm again. Mrs. Woodcott picked up the jar and shook it. The pills rattled loudly. "Beautiful, aren't they? Did you know that the yellow and black colour combination is used in nature to signify a virulent poison?" "Poisons are drugs and drugs are poisons," said Justine. "It's just a matter of terminology." "Commendably suicidal attitude," said Mrs. Woodcott. "Now, let me tell you about this capsule. I like to think of it as what our American friends call a double header. The first, and most significant component, is a synthetic variant on tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is a naturally occurring and highly potent neurotoxin. It is found in the pufferfish and the Japanese fugu. The method of operation of the substance is to block nerve signals by interfering with the sodium process through cells. Symptoms of tetrodotoxin poisoning included pulmonary oedemia, hypertension, cyanosis, hypothermia, respiratory distress, paralysis, and death. Sound good so far?" Justine nodded. The policemen were talking together in a small huddle. Their faces were strange and getting stranger. Mrs. Woodcott kept on talking, oblivious. "It is a folk poison capable of pharmacologically inducing an apparent state of death. In Haiti, its sacramental use is central to the zombie phenomenon. You've heard of zombies. At any rate, you've seen the videos, I'll warrant." The policemen were all turning to look at Justine. They were all smiling. They opened their mouths quite wide when they smiled. "The second component is a popular amphetamine derivative in a thick gelatine coating that takes several hours to dissolve in stomach acid. At the deepest part of the trance, the amphetamine kicks in and begins to bring you back up to consciousness. Imagine the surprise of the poor bloody morgue attendant when you come out of your trance on a trolley. Imagine your surprise if they've already locked you in a refrigerated cabinet with a limited air supply." "What's the amphetamine analogue called?" "Billy Whiz," said Mrs. Woodcott. She sipped her port and lemon. "At least, that's what I like to call it." She turned the yellow and black capsule over in her hand. "It really is a lovely little drug. I'd say the dosage in one of these would be about perfect for someone with your body weight." "How come you know so much about this drug?" "How come? Because I built it, dear." Over by the bar, the policemen were beginning to undress. With each piece of clothing they took off, their gestures grew more extravagant and stylized, like the movements of a dancer. Their fangs appeared as they smiled and leered, blowing kisses to the people sitting in the booths near them. "And is it possible," said Justine, "that there might be hallucinations as I come back up to consciousness?" "Certainly. Vivid dream hallucinations." A punky girl sitting beside the policeman got up hastily and tried to leave. One of the policemen grabbed her hand. "And could they be partly pure fantasy and partly take the form of a flashback?" "Do you mean like a Summer of Love style acid flashback? How sweetly nostalgic!" "Flashbacks were partly propaganda, of course. Take a tab of acid at the Student Union Freshers' Hop, and 10 years later you crash head-on into a semi while you're driving your family to church. But they do sometimes occur." Mrs. Woodcott drained her port and lemon and smiled. "The human mind is a strange and dangerous place, as I'm sure you've discovered, dear." The policeman who had grabbed the punk now spun her around as if they were going to dance in a Fred Astaire musical. But instead of dancing, he swooped forward, his mouth latching onto her throat. Justine noted that the big fangs were basically just for show. Getting the blood out of the girl's neck involved some kind of fungoid extrusion, where the policeman's tongue ought to be. A damp, grey pipe locked to the punk's throat, pulsing as it drank. Some excess blood splashed onto the surface of the bar. The fat publican sighed and wiped it up with a rag. "For instance," said Justine, "I might seem to be reliving an episode from my recent past with some weird shit thrown in." "Absolutely." The other policemen were doing a striptease, but not a very pleasant one, unless you were attracted to human skin with unusual textures and colours. The kind of texture and colours you might find in a mushroom that had been left too long in the fridge in a sealed plastic bag. The kind of mushroom that was beginning to melt. Justine reflected that she had never liked mushrooms. "Like the time I went to Notting Hill and went into a pub and scored a drug?" The hallucination could adopt any sort of delusional architecture, so yes, why not? One of the policemen was mincing across the pub towards the saloon bar, towards the corner where Justine and Mrs. Woodcott sat. "And could I be explaining something to myself in my head, like a dream where you're telling yourself you're asleep?" The policeman's tongue, such as it was flickering wetly in and out of his mouth. "Yes, dear, you might even have a person in it who seemed absolutely real. And that person might just be a construct made from memories of someone you met. Telling me it's all a dream. Well, they might not actually come out and say it, dear." The last of the trees had been cut down and dragged away. Now you could see the tunnel mouth of the project site quite clearly from the picture window, even when you were sitting down. Stephanie was admiring the view, sitting on the couch beside O'Hara. She had her feet up on a cushion on the coffee table beside the printer. While O'Hara was waiting for his call, she was printing out a questionnaire that had been prepared by the Butler Institute's psychology consultants. Stephanie caught the last sheet as it slid out of the printer. She got up and sauntered out of the room. O'Hara remained sitting on the couch, waiting to take the call that was coming in on the hour. Jack Blood appeared on the carpet in front of him. He was holding a rotting newspaper and a huge fan of Yellow Pages, and was wearing a 1930s newsboy cap. "Priority News," said Jack. The words came out of his carved mouth in the voice of the B&O television newswoman. The computer in the B&O had picked up something it deemed O'Hara should know about. "Pause," said O'Hara. Jack Blood froze. The newspaper extended in one twig-bundled hand, hanging in midair. The woman's voice faded. "Resume when this phone call is over." 3 images stabilised on the wall. The first to snap into focus was Mr. Pegram's physician. She advised O'Hara against exciting Mr. Pegram, then disappeared to be replaced by Pegram himself. O'Hara had never seen the old man looking so ill. The next image to arrive was that of the Oriental woman. Next was the teenage boy. He was wearing his ceremonial robes today. The woman was the first to speak. "Our shareholders are applying a great deal of pressure. People are becoming frightened." "My subjects are frightened as well," said the boy. "We've done our best to keep a lid on the situation," said Mr. Pegram, the rich, virile voice coming out of his withered face. "But too many people know. Word's getting out to the public. They know about the point of no return." On the floor under the living room, at the front of the house, Stephanie knocked and went into what used to be Patrick's bedroom. There were still toys on the floor, dragged into piles to make room for the stretcher from the helicopter. It was a bulky paramedical unit with on-board life support equipment and some monitoring hardware. Mulray was sitting in a child-sized chair, supposedly on guard duty. He got up when Stephanie came into the room and shambled out, heading for the kitchen. He was carrying a handgun and, considering his increasingly erratic behaviour, Stephanie might normally have been a little worried. But she had ordered the weapon especially for Mulray, from an armaments subsidiary, with a request that the firing pin was removed. When Stephanie was alone, she presented Vincent with the questionnaire, removing one set of handcuffs and giving the boy a pen to write with. She kept the other set of cuffs locked, one end attached to his wrist, the other to the frame of the bunk bed. Stephanie looked at the small decals that covered the heavy metal bunk bed. O'Hara had told her that his son loved this bed. Just one of those dumb things kids become fond of. As Stephanie turned to leave the room, she had a strong impulse. She wanted to touch Vincent, turn and go back into the room and touch the teenage boy handcuffed to the bed. It was an odd desire. It wasn't as though there was anything special about Vincent. He certainly wasn't good looking. But there was something about him. You wanted to grab his hand, touch his face, make contact. Vincent was watching her now, lying there on the undersized bunk bed. His eyes were afraid, but there was some other emotion too. Stephanie turned and hurried out of the bedroom. Upstairs in the living room, the hologram of Jack Blood stood waiting patiently for O'Hara to finish his conference call. "Frankly, I don't care what route we follow," the Oriental woman was saying. "So long as profits continue and there is agreement. But I have to know soon." "Don't be mistaken," said the boy. "Unless there is continuing progress, I will cease to back your project." "Have some faith," bellowed Mr. Pegram. "I agree with the prince," said the Oriental woman. "My company withdraws its support if there are any setbacks." "There will be continuing progress. There won't be any setbacks," said O'Hara. "That's more like it," said Mr. Pegram. As Stephanie came into the room, the Oriental woman disappeared from the wall, closing her call. The boy went next, leaving just Mr. Pegram's image. The old man, his face huge on the wall, stared at O'Hara. "You must succeed, my friend," said Mr. Pegram as his image began to fade. "We must triumph over the flesh." One of his pinkish eyes was spasming wetly, buried deeply in its nest of wrinkles. He might have been trying to wink. O'Hara turned to say something to Stephanie, but before he could speak, the hologram of Jack Blood unfroze, the B and O coming off pause. "The exciting life of one hovercraft continues its eventful course in New York City," said Jack, speaking in his newsreader's voice. "In a bizarre accident, a G-8 hovercraft has crashed into a security installation outside the King building, killing one guard and injuring 3 others. Once a police vehicle, the hovercraft was sold into private ownership and has only just been confiscated for use in a robbery. However, it now appears to have been stolen from the police pound and abandoned in spectacularly destructive style." "So, which drug is doing this to me?" said Justine. The floor of the pub consisted of bare planks scattered with sawdust, and the sawdust was doing a surprisingly good job of soaking up the blood. However, there were thick puddles here and there, and it was in the puddles that the policemen were dancing. Most of the policemen were completely naked now, except for their socks and big clumsy boots. The one coming towards Justine's table was also still wearing his striped CID tie. Justine leaned closer to Mrs. Woodcott, who had put on her spectacles and was now watching the policeman with some interest. "Is it the neurotoxin or the billy?" said Justine. The pale, damp skin of the policeman had a pronounced mottling now, a diseased fungus appearance. They moved and danced more or less as a single unit, and now they began to caress each other lasciviously. "Right, that's it," the fat man behind the bar sighed and stopped drying beer mugs. Gents, you're well out of order." He was reaching to ring the brass bell over the bar when 2 of the policemen dragged him to the floor and began to dismember him. "In answer to your question, most likely neither," said Mrs. Woodcott. "Neither?" The CID man with the tie reached the table just as Justine ran for the bar. She jumped up on the beer and blood-soaked surface and pulled one of the ornamental sabres down. The blade snagged on the string of Christmas tree lights, but it had an edge on it like a razor blade. It sliced through the wire as Justine pulled it free. It went through the CID man's neck almost as easily. "No, dear," said Mrs. Woodcott. "These hallucinations are almost certainly being caused by a little something extra I slipped in. A mind-bendingly powerful psychedelic, for instance. "You mischievous old bitch," said Justine, swinging the sword again. Mrs. Woodcott's white-haired old head went spinning across the pub floor and struck the brass footrail in front of the bar. It sounded like a bowling ball hitting the brass. "Ouch," said Mrs. Woodcott's head. "I didn't do it purely because I was a mischievous old bitch, however." The other policemen had begun to pay a little more attention to Justine since she had decapitated their colleague. They were closing in on her. Justine kicked Mrs. Woodcott's head through the half-opened door to the men's toilets and followed it through. She slammed the door behind her and bolted it. "You see," Mrs. Woodcott's head was saying, "these hallucinatory dreams are triggered to occur after the amphetamine takes effect. They happen as you begin to wake up. They help you orientate yourself and prepare yourself for consciousness." "They've been a great help. Thanks," said Justine. She nudged Mrs. Woodcott's head with the toe of her shoe and sent it splashing into the brimming urinal. The head surfaced, spluttering and blinking. "You should listen to me, dear. I am, if you like, the voice of your conscience. You're probably close to waking up and there are things you must remember." "I know. I'm beginning to remember some of them, like Vincent. He's the reason I'm here." Justine had to shout to make herself heard. The policemen were outside the lavatory door trying to batter it down. "I like all sorts of stupid things about Vincent. The way he talks and the way his mouth looks when he's smiling. And I like the fact that he's got powers. It's like he has a demon inside him." "That's nice, dear," said Mrs. Woodcott, bobbing in the reeking urinal puddle. "I want to get rid of that crap haircut of his and teach him things. Teach him not to say any of those stupid American things. Get him to dress nicely. Go to the pub with him. Show him off to people. And maybe use that demon in him a bit." "Ah, young love," slobbered Mrs. Woodcott's head. Bubbles were trickling up from her mouth as she began to go under. Justine dragged her out of the urinal and slammed her into the nearest sink. "I guess I really do like him a lot." She ran the taps, cleaning off Mrs. Woodcott and her own hands. "That's why I took that capsule in the drugstore. It was supposed to make me look like I was dead." "Oh, it did, believe me, it did." "Then I was supposed to be picked up by a medical team. It's a bit like a morgue party. They take me somewhere and I wake up inside when they least expect it. Except I'm going inside a place called the King Building. That's where they took Vincent. It's all part of the doctor's plan." "But the point is, they didn't keep Vincent there," said Mrs. Woodcott from the sink. "And don't talk to me about the doctor's plan. You didn't even wait until you were properly briefed." The battering noises were getting louder. It sounded as if the door would come off its hinges any second. "I'm supposed to wake up inside the King Building and let the others in." Justine took Mrs. Woodcott's head out of the sink. She set it upright on top of a cigarette-burn towel holder. Mrs. Woodcott's eyes were on the same level as Justine's now. "But you couldn't wait for the proper time, could you, you stupid girl?" Mrs. Woodcott's voice was changing. It was more like a young woman's, and there was something subtly different about her eyes. Justine noticed that the pounding at the door was subsiding. It wasn't as if the policemen were giving up. They were still attacking with ferocity, but the sound itself was growing distant. It was as if someone was turning the sound down on a video. "Am I coming out of the drug now?" "I certainly hope so," said Mrs. Woodcott in her young woman's voice. There was something familiar about that voice, and the eyes. Justine could identify the eyes now. They weren't Mrs. Woodcott's. They were Ace's. In fact, it was Ace's face she was looking at. Ace standing in front of her, instead of Mrs. Woodcott's head propped up on a towel container. Justine looked around herself. She wasn't in the men's room of a pub anymore. She was in a big, open-plan office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the windows was the night skyline of New York, glass skyscrapers with random small squares of light where people were working late. This office was deserted. From what Justine could see, it was full of desks and computers, each desk divided into its own little area by lightweight partitions. But the partitions around this one had all been knocked over, as if there had been a struggle. Some of the partitions had computer-printed charts on them. Others had large coloured photographs of spread-eagled young women. A man was lying beside the computer, sprawled across the desk, his face discoloured and bruised. Justine looked at the man, then at Ace. She realised that Ace was breathing hard, as if she'd just worked out or run a foot race. "Geezer's name is Christian. He was down on the 51st floor when their equipment blew the whistle on you. Unfortunately, that drug still leaves detectable brain activity." "What happened?" said Justine. "They detected it. So Christian brought you up here. If the Biostock isn't dead, he gets first dibs apparently." Ace looked at the unconscious man. "I hit him a bit harder than I meant to." "Thank you," said Justine. "You've been a right pain in the arse to everyone," said Ace. She took something from the pocket of her jacket. It was a small blue card like a credit card. Ace threw it onto the desk beside Christian's face. "I had to do your bit. It was me who had to let the others into this place." "Have you got Vincent with you?" "No, it's the doctor and a couple of cops." "I've just had a dream about very strange policemen," said Justine. "You ain't seen nothing yet," said Ace. She sat down at the desk, shoving the unconscious man over so she could get at the keyboard of the computer. Justine saw that there had been some kind of modification to the computer. A communications cable connected it to a single large chip that sat in a small box on the desk. The chip had a luminous line glowing all around it. Ace was typing on the screen. Glowing words appeared on the computer screen. "Where's the doctor?" A moment later, a response pushed up on the screen in a strange format, only 3 characters wide. ONR, OOF, WIT, HHE, LIC, OPT, ER. "How do we get up there?" Ace typed. ELE, VAT, ORC, OMI, NGU, P. The corridor outside the office was dim, except for access lights, and silent, except for a whisper of air conditioning. Ace and Justine stood on the thick carpet, waiting for an elevator. The flashing lights on the control panels showed that all 6 elevators were heading for their floor. "Which one is ours?" said Justine. "We've got a friend who can play this place like an arcade game," said Ace. She showed Justine the box with the chip inside it. The thin line around the chip glowed in the half-light. "All of them are ours." But the first elevator to arrive had 2 Butler Institute security guards sitting in it, blank-eyed and dead. Ace and Justine stepped back quickly, and the elevator stayed open for a minute, light shining out into the corridor. Then its doors whispered shut. Behind them, on the other side of the corridor, another elevator was opening. Ace and Justine turned to see a figure in combat armour holding a gun. The figure's face was a blank curve of mirror, the faceplate of a vicar's weapons helmet. It hinged up as one gloved hand pulled it back. Mancuso's eyes frowned from inside. "Are you coming or what?" From the roof of the King building, the Saturday night traffic looked like toys. Justine began to feel a sense of vertigo, so she pulled herself back from the guardrail and retreated from the edge of the roof. She stared up at the sky. It was the middle of the night, but the glow of the city illuminated grey rolling masses of cloud. The air was almost clear enough to breathe. Justine turned and walked back towards the centre of the rooftop. Ace was waiting for her by the helicopter, wind blowing in her hair. "Ready to go," she said. Inside the helicopter, the doctor and Mancuso were already strapped into their seats. "Can you fly this?" said Justine, choosing the seat immediately behind the doctor. "No," said the doctor. "Neither can I," said Mancuso, "but I know someone who can." She made some final adjustments on the communications link she had attached to the autopilot. The other end was connected to the large chip in its box, resting on the seat between Mancuso and the doctor. Ace settled into the seat behind Mancuso, fastening her seatbelt as the engines began to pulse and the helicopter rose into the night.